right, so it is 5 after, so let's get started. Ori?
Rabbi Boxman, can I interrupt for just 1 second?
Yes, Rabbi Boxman, you may.
First of all, good morning, good evening, Ori there, and so glad you're with us again. I just want to remind our congregation that tonight is our annual meeting at 7 p.m. So we need a quorum, which means we need about 75, 80 people. So please go online and register for the annual meeting so that we can conduct the business of the congregation and be together as a community tonight at 7. So just a reminder to all. Thank you for that public service announcement.
Rabbi, did we get an email with the link to that?
It was Jill. Yes, it was the Thursday email that went out every week. You know, the Thursday email for Jill.
All right, I'll go back and check.
Go back and see from Jill Ruddy for Thursday email. It's listed there.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Ori, I'll turn it over to you.
Rabbi, I can post the link in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Alan. Oh, it's great. I'm glad you're there.
Okay, great. It is good to see everyone again. And let me just get out of chat box and we are good. All right, shalom lekulam. Hello, everyone. We are currently, it seems that every week that we meet, there's either a commemoration day or a celebration of some kind. And tonight is no different this evening. We are celebrating Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, the counting of the Omer, the second day of Passover through 49 days, 7 weeks, which lands us right at the end of it, brings us to Shavuot, the holiday of Shavuot. It is a physical holiday in the sense we go from Exodus to our receiving of Torah at Mount Sinai. And in many ways, it can also be seen as a spiritual journey as well, even in our modern days, a period of reflection. In Israel, generally, we celebrate with bonfires, and the kids go out, and nothing, of course, says great idea for young kids than these huge bonfires with very little surveillance looking over them. And somehow, yet, we all managed to survive our childhood. Actually, the last couple of years, the idea of the bonfires has started to slow down because of the environmental challenges that it presents. We finally woke up and there's been a lot of restrictions on them to make them smaller, to unify classes together so that everybody's doing their own. But this year, there's been a complete restriction on any kind of bonfire and gathering. The only one that's going to take place is actually 3 different small ones that will take place on Mount Meron, which traditionally is the site of the burial of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi, who is associated with this holiday of Lag BaOmer, as is Rabbi Akiva. We mentioned a little bit during our journey together, and we can go into more details, but for the most part, there has been complete shutdown on all bonfires and heavy fines if anyone is at a bonfire or even near a bonfire, so that the excuse of, oh, it's not my fire, doesn't count. And of course, the reason for that is to try to keep people separate as much as possible to minimize the effects of the transition that Israel is going through. And you might have followed the news that our economy seems to be on its way back, at least as far as what's being allowed, what's being opened, the freedom that we're being given as far as where to shop, etc. That is a conversation for another time. I don't want to take too much time from our session, but that is what we're going through right now. And I'm happy to answer questions related to our session when we're finished, or related to Lag BaOmer, or related to what is going on in Israel right now. But to begin, I'm going to share my screen with you to remind us. See, hold on 1 second, slideshow. Okay, so clearly we're part of a 6-part session here, and we have the six sessions in your screen right now. We've gone through a few of them so far, and today we'll be focusing on where we ended last time, which was the beginning of Zionism. And if you remember, we spoke about this notion of where does Zionism begin? Is it in fact the 19th century, as we're about to discuss? Or in fact, has there always been a yearning to return to the land of Zion, which essentially is what Zionism is, Zion being a synonym for the land of Israel, a synonym for Jerusalem, mentioned in the Bible, mentioned in the book of, both in the Torah, but primarily in the book of Psalms, although in other places throughout the second and third sections of the Tanakh of the Bible. And we spoke about the fact that we already from exile, we talked about if I forget thee, Jerusalem, what happens. And we spoke about what happened in the Middle Ages when we wrote poetry yearning for this return to the land of Israel. So embedded in us is this constant need to be back in the land. So then, of course, the question will be, what in fact will be different this time around? Now, Mark Twain, of course, we all know, 1835, 1910, clearly one of the most iconic writers in the world, specifically in the United States, but in the world. In 1867, Mark Twain finds himself traveling throughout the Middle East. And while he's there, he is writing a series of articles that will ultimately be published in his newspaper that he's working for in San Francisco. Later, these will be published into a book called Innocents Abroad, which was published in 1869. In his lifetime, this was his hottest selling book. And it is his tales of his travels throughout the Middle East, including the Holy Land. Now, this particular excerpt that I have in front of you clearly is an interesting piece, because he talks about, of all the lands there are of dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. And he goes on, as you can read, talking about the fact that there's really nothing pretty here. There's nothing pleasant, nothing to rest your eye. Every outline is harsh, he says. Palestine is desolate and unlovely, and why should it be otherwise? And he talks about, is it enough that the fact that this is the Holy Land will make it beautiful? Now, I know that many of you have traveled to Israel, some of you with me, in fact. And you have seen the beauty that's here. So this he writes in 1867. So clearly something must have happened to transform what was to what you see. Now, as you begin to read some of the pieces that are on, and I'm going to go slow on on a few slides, just because with all the text that were there, I minimized as much as I thought I could, but there really is, I think, some essential pieces that are important to read in their primary source. 1882. Leon Pinsker, or Judah Leib Pinsker is his Hebrew name, is going to be of Eastern Jewry. He's going to be born in Poland, and he will be of those first that put pen to paper to talk about this transition that we have to go through as a Jewish people. Now, clearly, if we revert back to our last session, we spoke about the changes that are going on in Europe. We talked about the fact that this concept of Zionism is not in a bubble. It's not a standalone, but it is part of the transition that the world is going through. In Western Europe, we know, of course, of this nationalism that is happening, and nations are becoming, well, nations. They are unifying around certain ideologies, certain language, certain shared memories. And this is going to invoke amongst the Jewish people also a need to be part of that. Now, how is this going to be different? This is going to be different when we realize that it doesn't necessarily mean that we're just going to the Holy Land because of religious reasons. Now, again, I've underlined a few things to look at over here, but as we look at what Pinsker is talking about, while he isn't the first, we know already in 1862 that we have someone by the name of Moses Hess from Western Europe who is looking around, and he's saying, well, if Germany can be Germany and Rome can be Rome, why can't we be in the land of Israel? And he writes a text called Rome and Jerusalem, tapping into this notion of nationalism. It's coming from both Western Europe and Eastern Europe, even though their reality will be very different. And the transition that Western European Jews are going through, the emancipation because of the Enlightenment and the freedoms that the Jewish people feel that we're receiving. And we spoke about this last session. This will open up various paths. It will open up the disappearance of Jews. It will open up the notion of different streams of Judaism. It will also begin waves of anti-Semitism. Now, it's not to say, of course, that anti-Semitism didn't exist before, but the term itself is coined in the 19th century. This anti-Jewish sentiment now will not be based solely on religious differences, but within the political spectrum, that's where we begin to see anti-Semitism being pushed to the surface. What Pinsker is talking about here in 1882, and a die-hard socialist, even though born into an Orthodox traditional family, finds socialism, but ultimately will realize that that can't happen in the world in which he was living, but Jews have to lift themselves up and, well, essentially auto-emancipate themselves. Let now or never be our watchword. Woe to our descendants. Woe to the memory of the Jewish contemporaries. Help yourselves, and God will help you. We have to stand up for ourselves. Now, what we're looking at over here, and today I am going to be using this PowerPoint a little bit more than before, because there's a lot of words that were said by a lot of people that I think are essential for us understanding why we're shifting ourselves en masse at this particular time, and what were the ramifications of that ideology. Was there, in fact, only one ideology? Now, what you're looking at over here, we see a little bit of a map there with Israel in the center, of course, the land of Israel. But we're coming with the one arrow from Yemen, okay? So Jews who are from the Arab world, or what we would call today Mizrahi Jews, or Eastern or Oriental Jews. Sometimes that grouping, that umbrella identification that comes in juxtaposition to Ashkenazi Jews, or Jews who hail from Europe, is mislabeled as Sephardic. Now, indeed, Sephardic, Jews who hail from Spain, is in fact an ethnic identifier of a segment of Jews. But Jews who hail from the Arab world are much more than just Sephardic. In fact, there are Jews who are living in the Arab world in countries in North Africa and Arab countries that can date themselves all the way back to the first exile in 586. The reason I put this map on the screen is to identify, which is also sometimes mistakenly recognized, that it was only Ashkenazi Jews that came in the 1880s, as you can see in the clip in front of you. There were also, in particular, Yemenite Jews who were arriving. Interesting enough, however, this is where they differed, meaning those Jews who are coming from Eastern Europe and those who are coming from the Arab world. And that is what propelled them to come. And in fact, what is going to propel the Jews of Yemen to come is still that anchor in that old notion of returning for religious purposes. Because the year 1882 corresponds with the gematria, or the numerology associated with the lettering of the quote from the book of Psalms, let me climb the palm tree, Aliyah Tamar, which again comes to the year 1882, as you can see in the slide. So for religious purposes, but also for other reasons as well. It's going to be those other reasons which will propel the individual that you see in front of you. And this, Theodor Herzl, Theodor Benjamin Ze'ev Herzl, born in Hungary in 1860, is going to grow up in, I would say, somewhat of an religiously isolated, meaning isolated from religiosity, meaning a secular Jew, who does have a bar mitzvah, we're told, maybe even just goes to the synagogue for the party, not more than that. When he's 18 years old, his family moves to Vienna, really to be of those transitional Jews that are grabbing that emancipation by the horns, to live up to their greatest expectations of themselves, to be equal in the eyes of their peers, whether those peers are in Germany, in Vienna, in England, or in France. Now, he always wanted to be a writer, but his mother wanted him to be a lawyer. And being a good Jewish boy, he became a lawyer. However, he's going to very quickly fall back into his what his heartstrings pull him towards. And he becomes a writer. He becomes a journalist for a newspaper in Vienna. And in 1894, he will be covering the hottest story of the day. And the hottest story of the day was a story that was unfolding in Paris, France, in which a Jewish captain in the French army, a man by the name of Alfred Dreyfus, will be accused of espionage, spying for the Germans who were the enemies of France. This, by the way, will be a sham. It'll be a frame. And ultimately, we see that his sword will be broken in front of everyone. His epaulets will be ripped off of his shoulders very disrespectfully. And he will be court-martialed and sentenced to death. That will be commuted very quickly to life imprisonment on Devil's Island. And surprisingly or not, by 1909, he will be released from prison because of the efforts of the head of intelligence of the French army, who is known to be an actual anti-Semite, but recognizes that there's been a lot that was swept under the rug, and in fact, the real culprit was left loose. So ultimately, Dreyfus will be freed. But this will be transformative for Theodor Herzl, who is in the streets in 1894 covering the story when he hears death to the Germans. Oh, got that. Death to the traitors. Oh, that's a good one. I got that down too. Death to the Jews. The who now? The what now? Meaning, why the Jews? In the mother of all democracies, why are the Jews being blamed? And it will wake him up. And when it wakes him up, he realizes that his life is going to take on a new trajectory. In 1896, he will write a very thin pamphlet called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, in which he lines out the steps that are necessary for the Jewish people to ultimately survive, and that is to create a political mechanism that will allow them the institutions they need to be able to live as sovereign under their own flag. And this will be groundbreaking. Now, this book, within a year, is going to be translated to something like 12 languages, meaning it takes the Jewish people by storm, because as opposed to Pinsker, who in fact does fan the flames, Theodor Herzl will take that and run with it. Now, he will be the first to say, anything I say has already been said by others before me. So we shouldn't be mistaken to think that it was Herzl who invented Zionism, but he will be the father of what is called political Zionism. And in 1897, in August, in Basel, Switzerland, by the way, the reason that the first World Zionist Congress that Herzl will convene happens in Basel, Switzerland, is because he came to the Jews in Germany, which was the epicenter of Jewish culture and Jewish life, and says, we want to do this Congress here. This Congress is going to be the first time that the Jewish leadership in the world convenes to talk about the Jewish future as a collective since the year 425, when the Byzantine Roman Empire outlaws the Sanhedrin. So it's mind-boggling that this can happen now, and the Jews of Germany say, you know what? We're good. We don't want to rock the boat. In Basel, Switzerland, it takes place at the end of August, and in the aftermath of this convention. This is an excerpt from what Herzl writes in his journal. If I were to say this aloud, I would be answered by universal laughter, if not in 5 years, certainly in 50 years, and everyone will know it. This is in 1897. In 1947, the United Nations will say yes to a partition plan that essentially will lead us to a Jewish state, 50 years to the year. Was he a prophet? Was he a visionary? Did he just get lucky? Maybe a combination of all of the above. Now, this transition that happens, you know what? I'm going to get out of the share for a second so we can all see each other. There we go. This transition that happens, that Herzl goes through, that ignites the Jewish people, is going to, for the first time, designate the land of Israel as being a place where a political entity of some kind could be established, where the Jews would once again reestablish, or to use the language of the British, reconstitute themselves under their own sovereign control. Now, just so we get a sense of numbers and what's going on here, We know that there's always been a Jewish community in the land of Israel, even from the days of exile, even from the days of the Romans. Now, to be clear, Jews were never in control. The control was taken from them from the days of the Hasmoneans, when Pompey comes marching into town. Now, when that happens in 63 before the Common Era, and ultimately Herod gets placed as a sovereign Jewish king, ultimately a vassal king, we've lost control. And if it wasn't the Roman pagans, it was the Roman Christians. And if it wasn't the Roman Christians who were the Byzantines, it was the Muslims. And if not the Muslims, it was the Christians again with the Crusaders, or it was the Mamluks, or it was the Ottomans, or it was, well, that's where we're at right now. Meaning at the end of the 19th century, the Ottomans are in control. They were about in the 1840s, so before the ignition of this Zionism, there's about 10,000 or so Jews who are living here. And I just want to be clear. We should not take the numbers that I'm telling you as Torah from Sinai, meaning we have very few actual authentic accounts of censuses that were done, because it wasn't done, meaning the Ottoman Turks were in control. Palestine was essentially it was a section of, it was a province of the Greater Ottoman Empire. And the numbers that I share with you come from various sources. They come from the Ottomans census that they did occasionally. It came from the British who were here as travelers or as explorers. It came from people like Mark Twain, meaning the numbers, well, they're not exact, but we do know that the Jews were a strong minority, meaning that not that they were large in numbers. In fact, they were small in numbers. About 10,000 or so Jews who were living here in the 1840s amongst about 250,000 Arabs. By the end of the 19th century, we're looking at about 60,000 Jews and about 370,000 Arabs. So in fact, we're seeing that this immigration, these waves of immigration are not just amongst the Jews, but there seems to be an influx of Arabs who are coming as well, mostly from Egypt, but also from other areas, from other regions around Palestine within the Ottoman Empire. So it's not that people were crossing borders, they were just moving their location of where they were living. But between 1882 and 1903, we have the beginning of what will be called the first Aliyah, the first wave of immigration. Now, this first wave of immigration automatically tells us that there was at least a second wave of immigration. And it happens because of pogroms that are happening in Eastern Europe. 1882, we have major pogroms that are happening, these organized attacks against Jews, conducted by the czars of Russia, meaning they were the puppet masters, even though they said it was spontaneous because the Jews assassinated or attempted to assassinate one of the czars. Of course, accusations that are made against the Jews, which ignites these pogroms, which ignites 2.2 million Jews between 1882 and 1924 to leave their old country. I say their old country because we know that for the Jewish people, there are multiple old countries. And they make their way not to Palestine, but to the United States. Why 1924? Because America closes its borders there. During that same period of time, you're looking at about 200,000 or so Jews who are arriving in Palestine, about half who either will die or leave. Now, that first wave of immigration is going to be by Jews who don't know what they're doing. The land that they're moving to in the land of Israel, in Palestine, will be purchased for them by Jewish philanthropists, some like Rothschild or Montefiore, who will go ahead and buy the land up from either the Ottoman Turks themselves, because they were the masters of the land. That's how things worked back then. Or from the Effendis, the absentee Arab landlords, who also had swaths of land. Now, more times than not, the land that was purchased was sight unseen, and maybe with a postcard that looked like great lakefront property and ended up being in swampland infected with mosquitoes and, of course, malaria. But as Jews begin to return, we begin to see that those Jews who arrive are going to be creating settlements that will be called the singular moshava, which means a township, not a kibbutz, not a moshav, but a moshava. Places like Rishon LeZion, places like Rosh Pina or Zichron Yaakov, you might recognize some of those names. And not knowing exactly what we were doing, those Jews who arrived begin to hire the locals to either help with the working of the land, agriculture, or the defending of the land to guard the premises, the areas, or to do it for them. So either with them or for them. Those locals are the local Arabs who are here, the farmers who are here. Now that's going to be significant to understand, because when we talk about the difference between the first Aliyah, the first wave of immigration, and the second. Now, when this is happening, and the shift in where we see that transition to Palestine, the numbers are going to stay very, very low here, relatively speaking, and yet it is feet on the ground. And for the first time, we're seeing the Jews are returning to the land, not to the four holy cities, which were Jerusalem and Hebron, because that's where the cave of the matriarchs and the patriarchs was, the Machpelah cave, where Abraham and Sarah and the gang are buried. Tiberias, where the Talmud, among other things, was written. And Tzfat, which is that Kabbalistic city that we spoke of last session. Now, as we begin to stretch our legs a little bit, there seems to be a dying down. By 1903, we see that there's a bit of a drop in this waves of immigration, as I mentioned, the malaria and the fact that we really didn't know what we were getting into. And ultimately, there's going to be even more pogroms that are going on in Europe. Now, while this is, now I'm just going to go back and share the screen. Now what we see over here on the screen is this gentleman over here that's going to be very influential. Chaim Nachman Bialik, who is going to have been born in Russia, of course, raised Orthodox. I say of course because everybody was Orthodox back then, until there was a transition, until they were no longer, meaning being influenced by the waves of emancipation that were happening, and they were happening in a different frame than they were happening in Western Europe. The cultural renaissance that was happening in the Jewish cultural renaissance that was happening in Eastern Europe was different than that of Western Europe. But ultimately, he becomes part of this milieu of Jewish writers and people who really understand, I guess, the pulse of a nation, in that transition, that yearning to return to the land. Now, why do I say the transition? Because at the end of the 19th century, when he writes his first poem that was published called The Bird, in this particular poem, he talks about the Jewish people being in Eastern Europe, in their shtetl, cowering in the corners, and the bird traveling to the Holy Land, and the Jewish people asking the bird, tell us, what's it like over there? Tell us, is it really as beautiful as it's described? Tell us, are our people impoverished there? What's going on? Meaning without even the faintest of one day transitioning over there. And then in 1903, by which point he has raised himself to really being a poet laureate of the Jewish people, ultimately of the land of Israel itself, where he will move a little bit later in life. But he is sent to write what he sees in the aftermath of a pogrom that takes place in Kishinev in Bessarabia. After he witnesses the outcome of this pogrom, which happens because of a blood libel in which Jews are accused, still in the beginning of the 20th century, of killing Christian babies because it happens around Easter, 49 Jews will be killed. Now, to be crass, we have had worse before and worse after, clearly. And yet, this will be transformative as far as the Jewish people are concerned. And the main reason is because we hear about it. Now, as you can read here, and I've only taken a few excerpts, please know it's a very, very long, epic poem. But essentially, if I were to summarize, I would tell you that he says the springtime was upon us, birds were chirping, flowers were blossoming, and blood flowed through the streets. The new year had come upon us, springtime was in the air, and you hid in the corner, and you prayed to your God. please save me. And when they ravished your wives, you said, is she still permissible to me? He comes fingers blaring as who's responsible for this pogrom. And clearly it's the Jews who are responsible. Now, as this happens, this is going to ignite also that wave, that generation that will transition from the first Aliyah to the second Aliyah, the second wave of immigration. And I'll leave this shared screen so that we can see each other again. And I will read to you a letter that is sent out to the Jewish youth of Europe in the aftermath of this pogrom by a guy by the name of Joseph Witkin, one of the early leaders of the Zionist movement in the land of Israel. And this is what he writes. Prepare yourselves to fight nature, to struggle with disease, hunger, people, friends, enemies, brothers, strangers, Zionists and anti-Zionists. Prepare yourselves for the hatred and cruelty of the environment where you will be regarded as dangerous competitors. Be prepared for mockery and denigration. Prepare yourselves for confrontation with all-consuming despair and for baseless arguments which can nevertheless be laid to rest only by struggle and achievement. He goes on and on and on, but essentially, and I never studied marketing, but how can he possibly be using this language to encourage people to come? Ladies and gentlemen, yes, come, it's gonna be great. You know what? With both Rabbi Boxmans, you should go to Israel. And you know what? It's gonna suck. You're gonna hate it. And you know what? You might not even make it back alive. Oh, sign me up. So what's he thinking? He is essentially thinking, well, these are, and what generation is he speaking to? The 16, the 17, the 18-year-olds. And I'm sure we all remember what it feels to be that way. We know what it means to be invincible. And if we don't remember like that, maybe we remember being on the receiving end of someone who was 17 years old and maybe didn't see eye to eye ideologically, because this generation is going to stand up and say, Mom, Dad, we love you, but you're wrong and we're right. In fact, we have a letter in response to Joseph Witkin's letter. In actuality, between you and me, this is a response to a similar letter written by Menachem Usishkin, but the same idea. And this is what the president of his youth group writes, a 19-year-old from Poland. Dear sir, we are a group of young men, bachelors, and students who wish to immigrate to the land of Israel. We know of the moral corruption devastating the settlers of the land. We know of the baseness of those who should be setting a noble example for all of the diaspora, and we therefore see a great, if not the greatest, need to create a fresh national foundation in the land of our forefathers upon which to build the great structure of national revival. We are well aware of the enormous obstacles that we will find in our path. We are ready to work, suffer, endure in silence for the ideal that is the content of our lives, and to do this in the only land where we can find the solution to all of our ill and bitter problems. And now we ask you, dear brother, is our desire acceptable for the general progress of our movement's work? And is it possible in the present political and economic conditions of life in Palestine? With the blessings of Zion, in the name of all of my friends, yours respectfully, David Green. What's David Green saying? Bring it on. Whatever you need, we're there. Now, David Green will later go ahead and change his name to David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion, who will, you can see here on one of our older banknotes, David Ben-Gurion, who was to be our first prime minister, among many other things. He's here, by the way, on this banknote, on the backdrop of Kibbutz Sde Boker, which is where he ultimately would move to his vision of conquering the desert. And again, perhaps a conversation for another time. And yet, it's that ideology that we need to embody ourselves in working the land of Israel. Ourselves. Not to hire the locals to do it. Now, coming back to our shared screen over here, in the aftermath of this pogrom, we begin to see the different ideologies that were going to evolve. Now, it'd be nice if all Jews thought and acted like one body, but we all clearly know Jews, and we know that that would be a shanda. And ultimately, what we end up is different ideologies of how to be a Zionist. Theodor Herzl, we already mentioned, this figure that was messianic in his ability to unify the people. Very sadly, he would not live to see his own dreams fulfilled. And in fact, when he talks about this notion of im tirtzu ein zo agada, if you will it, it is not a dream, that dream he sadly will not see himself because he dies in 1904. But these waves of immigrants are going to bring with them different understandings of how to make it happen, like A.D. Gordon, the philosophical leader of a movement to be identified with labor Zionism. Now, what you're looking at here is a photo, a copy of a series of sugar packets that we found in our cafes over here that had all the who's who in Israeli early history in Zionism. So over your latte or your hafuch or your café americano, you could learn a little bit about the Zionist leaders. And I just translated what's written on the back of the packet here. But this notion of a 48-year-old grandpa, I say grandpa because as far as the kids were concerned, these were the 17 and 18-year-olds, he was this guru. And yet he himself was inspired by them as well. And they will be of the generation that invents the kibbutz, that agricultural communal settlement born in 1909, as being a way to manifest the ideology and the philosophy behind it. As part of this movement of the second wave of immigration, the second Aliyah, both men and women, very sadly, most of the figures that we've discussed have been men. Not because there weren't women involved in all these waves of history, but sadly, as we know historically, the records are kept by those who were in control, which was mostly men. And yet these waves of immigration are going to include, of course, women. The numbers aren't going to be 50% and 50%, but we see from the very earliest days of the World Zionist Congress, from the second wave of immigration, the second World Zionist Congress that happens in 1898, women will be equal voting members of the Congress. Now, of course, it sounds obvious, and yet think about suffrage. Think about when the Western world gives the vote, doesn't give anything, allows for justice to take place where women get the vote. So already forward thinking. Now, having said that, not everything was rosy with this period of Zionism, and yet Rachel Blaustein, who is I would say a pillar of this period of time. And if you ask Israelis, what is your favorite poem by Rachel Blaustein? They may not know, but if you say, tell me your favorite poem of Rachel. Rachel. Generations and generations before Madonna was Madonna, Rachel was Rachel. And she comes to the land of Israel, to Palestine, not to essentially work the land. She comes en route to Europe for a vacation of sorts. And she's going to Europe to study, from Russia, where she's born, to study in Western Europe art. And she finds herself teaching in a kindergarten class in one of these new moshavot, these new townships that were created. And as a young person perhaps, and this vivaciousness that young people have, she meets a friend of hers, a woman named Chana Meisel. And Chana says to her in not so many words, you know what, you're kind of cool. I'm going up north to this training farm to learn how to be a farmer. Are you in? And Rachel says, sure. And they go up north. Now, ultimately, as I mentioned, it wasn't all rosy. It wasn't that at the end of every day, these young men and women were dancing around the bonfire, singing and dancing to the hora. In fact, there was real tension, as you can imagine. Meaning at a certain point, the women actually wake up and they say, wait a second, why are we in the kitchen? Why are they out in the field, the men? Wasn't this supposed to be a utopian new ideology that's being created, even as described in that 1902 novel that was written by Theodor Herzl called Alt Neuland, Old New Land, in which he describes 20 years down the road what a Jewish state will look like when everyone is equal? Yeah, we're not equal here, we're out of here. And they go down the road and they create a training farm just for women. But the grave that you see here is in Kinneret Cemetery, this place where these Jews came together to learn how to be farmers. They would ultimately create, as I mentioned, the first kibbutz in 1909 called Kibbutz Degania. But Rachel, before World War I, she actually is sent by her kibbutz to Europe to learn agriculture so that she could come back and teach this agriculture, teach agronomy to the rest of the kibbutz. She gets stuck in Europe during the war and only is able to come back after the war in 1919. During the war, she takes care of refugee children. She comes back when she can as part of this third wave of immigration in 1919. She returns to her kibbutz, and sadly, she will have contracted in Europe tuberculosis. Very contagious, of course. She's removed from the kibbutz, and she makes her way through various hospitals near Tiberias or Poria, near Tzfat, in Jerusalem, and ultimately in Tel Aviv, where she will die in 1931. Now, even in her physical days of working the land, she was a poet already, but even more so when she physically wasn't able to. Now, you can see over here these two poems that I've chosen. She doesn't see in anything she's done anything amazing. I cannot offer you my land in praise heroic deeds. She's talking about Jewish fighters like Joseph Trumpeldor. That's not me, she says. One tree I planted on the way which to the Jordan leads. One narrow path to my feet yields, which runs across the fields. She talks about the fact that she has never written anything of greatness, like, for example, Chaim Nachman Bialik. She says, all I've done is gone ahead and planted this tree. This was the sense that was felt amongst these young people. We're not doing anything. And this is how she saw herself. Now, she wrote both this introspection. She also spoke about what she saw, the fact that it seemed like a haze or a dream. She also wrote about the beauty that she saw in front of her. She spoke about her own loss and her own pains. For example, she writes about her unborn son, and she never had a child herself. She wasn't able. And she calls it barren. In fact, that's why I'm named how I'm named, because my parents who were here and met here in the late 60s, post 67, fell in love with Rachel and her poetry. She wrote about, if I had a son, Uri, I would call him. He would be shchol taltalim, with black curly hair, wise, intelligent, beautiful. Meaning Rachel touches on the society of the state of Israel long after her death. Now, during this period of time, Rachel will be the voice of a nation, but there's other Zionists, and in this particular case, we know that there's religious Zionism. We talked about the fact that this is going to be a new wave of Jews who are arriving, Jews who are here not for religious reasons, and yet there will be those religious Jews who say this is a turning point for the advent of the coming of the Messiah. Now, this is going to be very significant because there's real tension between those traditional Jews, and I'll use the word traditional for now to identify those who are more orthodox, religious, as opposed to the secular Jews, meaning this is a new term. Secular Judaism. It's almost an oxymoron because these Jews are saying that, in fact, as opposed to those streams of Judaism, especially the progressive ones that were developing in the 19th century in Europe, that we begin to see that the identity of a Jew isn't just in the religion, but in the nationality. And nationality, not yet a state of Israel, of course, but the Jewish people are a people. Now, that's nothing new. We always knew we were a people and more than just a religion. But those new Jews are going to reinterpret what that means when they say, the second Aliyahers do, no synagogue needed, no rabbis needed, because we are going to work the land of Israel, defend the land of Israel, and we're going to speak Hebrew as our vernacular. That in many ways is going to bring tension between those religious Jews who reserve Hebrew, for example, only for study and for prayer. And yet this man, Isaac Abraham Cook, is going to be one of bridging of hearts, it was said of him, and bringing people together. And when his students would come and say, how can we open our arms to these secular Zionists? Who are they to bring faster than God would like to see a Jewish state? And he said to them, we have to unify as a people. And in fact, every one of us has the ability to repair the world. They in their way and we in ours. And that was important, especially when people said, when he would say, what does it mean to you to love your neighbor as yourself? If it means only to love people who are like me, then we haven't done anything. And that was of the nature of Cook. But in addition, we also have, we have a Chada'am, spiritual or cultural Zionism. And a Chada'am, whose name was Asher Ginsburg, he took the nom de plume of Chada'am, which means one of the people, who will go ahead and say, Theodor Herzl, you're wrong, which is kind of ironic because in Tel Aviv, Herzl Street intersects with Chada'am Street. But you're wrong. It is not our place to start top down, to create political institutions and get an international charter from the superpowers that were at the time, whether they were the Ottoman Turks who thought they were these superpowers, but they were in control of Palestine, or the British or the Americans. It is up to us, however, to replant ourselves in the land of Israel and to create Jewish life there. And Jewish life within which we have Jewish culture isn't just playing a clarinet and klezmer music and dancing the, as I mentioned before, the hora. But it's Jews doing carpentry and Jews doing music and Jews doing art and Jews doing science. And the moment we have Jews living as productive members and creating, like all other nations, a society, we will not only strengthen ourselves with pride, we will strengthen the Jews who are living out of the land of Israel, because the countries in which they are living, which up until now have seen them as just, well, a separate body amongst them, they will see to the greatness that we are creating in the land of Israel, and they will look to their own Jews and say we should give them more freedoms. So very different, but cultural Zionism. In addition, we have Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky, who will go ahead being inspired by these words of Theodor Herzl. He will in fact point to Herzl and say, there is no one that I can identify that inspired me more in who I am than Theodor Herzl. But he will take perhaps to another level when he will say, you know what? The Arabs who are here, they're here to stay. This is their land. But they have to recognize that they don't have to worry what our response is towards them. They only have to respond, they only have to be concerned with how they will treat us. Because based on that, we will defend ourselves. No longer will we be in the corners. And he will be the father of what will be known as revisionist Zionism, ultimately the spiritual father of what later will become a political arm called the Likud Party. By the way, in juxtaposition to those who would be of the labor Zionist camp, like David Ben-Gurion, that of course will be the founders of the labor movement in Israel. Now, during World War I, and we're coming to an end here, so we're almost done. If we want to identify perhaps some of the undercurrents which lead us to one of the most prominent issues that Israel deals with today, and that is the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs in the region. By the way, it's separate from the specifics of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and that's a different topic. Sometimes they can be misconstrued into being one and the same, and we'll talk about what I mean as we go through perhaps the next couple of sessions. But the British, during World War I, are going to go ahead and essentially back several different horses, if we use the horse races as an analogy. And they go ahead in 1915, in a series of letters called the McMahon letters, they're going to, with the help of Lord McMahon, is going to send out a correspondence with Sharif Amir of Mecca, meaning the leader of the largest Arab clan based in Saudi or in Arabia. And in this, they will promise those Arabs a country of their own if they fight with them against the Ottoman Turks. Of those who are involved in the reaching out to those Arab clans would be a guy by the name of Lawrence, of course, Lawrence of Arabia. This is known as the McMahon Letters. What you're looking at on the screen right now is 1916 and what's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which, forgetting about that particular agreement with Sharif Hussein, is going to be the division of the Middle East, even before World War I is over, between the British and the French, and even the Russians are going to get involved. And they'll be divided into areas of control and areas of influence. Now, it doesn't end here with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But what you see in front of you, 1917 now, also before the World War I is over, Lord Rothschild is going to go ahead, the foreign minister of His Majesty's government is going to write to the most important Jew that, Balfour, the foreign minister of His Majesty's government, is going to write to the most important Jew that they knew. I'm being facetious, but ultimately in England, one of the, by no means the leader of the Zionist movement, but one who of influence, Rothschild. And they say in not so many words, His Majesty's government sees with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, what does that mean exactly? What is this homeland? Is it a state? Is it a country? Is it a political entity? It's not entirely clear. And the leadership of the Zionist movement is going to say, well, we don't exactly like it, but we'll take it. Now, who were the British to see with favor anything in November 2nd, 1917? Well, that's a different conversation. But while there's clearly more slides that we can get to, I think that this is a good stopping point. It's a good stopping point not only because we're almost done with our hour, but it's a nice transitional moment. Because up until now, we've taken steps to, well, encourage Jews to return to the land of Israel. We're seeing that there's a population of Arabs who are already living here. The concept of nationalism is clearly something which is embedded in the Jewish people from time immemorial, that we are part of a nation. But this notion of taking that and superimposing that as a political entity in the land of Israel at this point is going to begin in the middle of the 19th century, but clearly fueled by eons of collective memory that this is where we come from and this is where we want to be. This will clearly influence also the Arab population of the Middle East in general, but specifically of Palestine. I say influence because this is where we get into some politics that we'll touch on as we get towards the end. But sometimes there's claims which are made in which Palestine was taken away from the Palestinians who had a country here already. Now, I want to spell that out clearly, really for myself to know where I stand in this particular presentation, but also for you, in that it has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not there are Palestinians today. And in fact, there are. But if we want to talk about the origins, it's important to understand that we look at the facts as best as we can. And I know that sometimes people confuse facts with narrative. And it's important to discern that they don't always overlap. Again, what I just said should not indicate to you who we voted for in our last elections, which is a whole other session because, well, it seems that things are changing there as well. And there'll be other times where I talk about facts as I understand it, that again also shouldn't identify who Uri votes for. But it is important to know that there is an undercurrent of nationalism that is being felt in Palestine by those local Arabs. And the reason that I point that out is because in the aftermath of World War I, and the implementation of the decisions that were made or the agreements that were signed during World War I will raise to the top issues of the ambiguity of the British, promising everything to everyone. Now, clearly that's a certain shallowness to that particular statement, because there's clearly much more depth. But we'll go into that a little bit as we begin our next session and we move forward through the mandate period, because that first period of time after World War I will bring a military government by the British for about 2 years. And then by the end of 1919, come 1920, a mandate will be bestowed upon the British, whereas they will be in control of this Palestine until officially the locals can rule themselves. And that is bestowed upon by the League of Nations, because you know the aftermath of World War I, well, there was a redivision of the world, at least in Europe and in the Middle East. And that is also important to remember. Sometimes when we think back politically, how did we get to where we are today? Or geopolitically, how did we get to where we are today? And what do we think about that? Sometimes we fall into the trap of looking at history out of its context. And I think it's important to remember the context in which certain decisions were made and certain agreements were signed, and of course, all the ramifications which came out of them. Okay, that's it for today. I'm happy to stick around if we want for a few minutes for any questions, and if we can't, I'm always happy to take questions. I know there's a question out there, and as I mentioned in the chat in the beginning, different periods of time, what was the population of the Jews in the land, and I'll send that out.
Thank you so much, Ori. So for everyone, we will stick around if anyone has more questions, but I just wanted to remind everyone that next week is our final session. It's going to be a double session. We didn't want to have to host class on Memorial Day. So next Monday will be a double session, which means it'll be close to 2 hours, maybe a little bit less. I know it's hard to be in front of the screen for so long. So that will be then. And Dad, did you have any closing remarks?
No, just thank you, Ori, and thank you, Ariel, and thank you everybody for participating. So I guess I don't want to use any more time unless anybody has a question they'd like to pose to Ori at this time.
I have a question. May I ask a question, Rabbi?
Sure.
My name is Tony. At one point, England offered Herzl the land now called Uganda in Africa. To what prompted the British to make this offer, and did Herzl seriously consider the offer?
Great question. During this time, in the aftermath of the First World Zionist Congress, the goal of Herzl, and one of the reasons that he actually ended his life ended so soon, he was a young man of 44 years old, had to do with exhaustion, pure exhaustion, because he was a man of action, and he traversed the world looking for what he identified as a charter. We want to have a political umbrella to provide us the backing we need to be a free people in our own land, or whatever that land may be. Now, initially, it was only going to be the land of Israel, although there were other options on the table, one of which was Argentina, actually a part of Argentina. And the other was, as you mentioned, in 1902 or 1903, was that part of East Africa. The reason that is while I wasn't the fly on the wall, the conversation between Herzl and the British was, listen, we don't have control of Palestine. The Ottomans do, even though, and I'll put in parentheses for a second, we already start to see world powers want a foothold already from the 19th century in Palestine, setting up either convents or churches and as way stations, and then political embassies and consulates. But the British say, listen, we can't give you Palestine right now, but how about we have some control in Africa? You can go ahead and have a temporary state until the situation is such that allows us to give you part of, or be there for your charter for Palestine. Herzl brings this to the World Zionist Congress about a year and a half or so before he dies. Interesting enough, when it's brought to the plenum, there were delegates that were from Western Europe that say, you know what are we going to do? Let's take it, a bird in the hand, or, two in the bush. And the delegates from Eastern Europe say, absolutely not. We will never replace one diaspora with another. Now, maybe as a means to understanding why would one side of Europe vote one way and one on the other, what was it that the delegates from Eastern Europe had felt on their own flesh? And these are the active pogroms. Now, it's not to say that there weren't cries of hip, hip, which was this derogatory term against Jews used in Vienna and other places in Western Europe. And there wasn't anti-Semitism. I mean, look at the Dreyfus affair. Just when Jews thought, you know what, I'm going to be free and I can be like the French and being an officer in the French army. Well, that's as French as you can get. That wasn't enough to protect Jews. So there's still clearly anti-Semitism. But the Jews in Europe, they were dying because of it. And they absolutely said, no, no, no. And there was a real uproar. It was almost a civil war within that delegation. So it was very quickly rejected.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a quick question. Ori, are
Yes.
you going to discuss the Jordan River meetings that are going on quietly on the West Bank?
You mean today?
No, I'm not in the last class. It's a double class. I'd like to have your interpretation because I thought that was an important issue, and the fact that these unusual people are meeting on that issue.
Barry, just so I'm clear, are you talking about the return of land that was leased in the agreement with Jordan in 1994?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about the unusual people that are meeting to resolve the issue of water regarding the Jordan River.
Yes, we'll absolutely talk about what's happening today in Israel, especially according to water, dealing with water, because that is a major proponent of a lot of the challenges we have in the creation of these modern states, especially, and we'll see this in the 1960s.
The unusual people that are willing to talk to each other. That's what I think is most interesting.
Okay, sure.
Around,
Yes.
around
Yes.
that time of the second and third Aliyah, there was a large influence in Eastern Europe of Bolshevism and Karl Marx.
Yes.
And a lot of the early Bolsheviks were Jews. What influence did they have on the Aliyahs?
Well, and I'm not going to get too much into it right now because it really is much more of an extensive answer, but I will tell you that the notion of, I mean, Bolshevikism, it's a little bit later, but if I look at the base of socialism, and I mentioned already the second Aliyah, and even the third Aliyah, by the way, the third wave of immigration was also very much influence of that working the land, protecting the land, speaking Hebrew, really the socialist ideals. But there were socialists all the way through, by the way, the 1940s, even during the Holocaust, in which we know of Jewish socialists who said, we have to be socialists in the land in which we're living, whether that's Russia or Poland or anywhere else. As far as Jews being part of the Bolshevik revolution, the communist revolution, yes, there were Jews who were involved there. And even when there were those kibbutzim and those agricultural settlements here that were the epicenter of socialism in Israel, there were those who split, those who thought that Lenin was, in fact, and then Stalin was, in fact, going to be the savior and had all the right ideas, and those who thought that, in fact, that shouldn't be the way that we progress forward. So there was tension between the different kinds of socialists that were here.
Okay, thank you, Ori. I think that we've had a chance to get some good questions, and I would suggest that people maybe submit in the chat room if there's others that Ori might be able to respond to, for next week or in writing. Ori, any comments?
No, the only comment I would say is that as we enter into Lag BaOmer, and the backdrop that I see for David Citron's screen there looks like a giant bonfire as I've been staring at it all evening, is that this notion of being in the midst of a period of time known as the Omer, a time where traditionally there was a plague that was lifted against, in which killed thousands and thousands of Rabbi Akiva's students. And this is why we celebrate on this day. Or if we look at the modern Zionist history that we're discussing now, and of people who transition themselves from Europe and in their own minds wanting to reinvent themselves as a strong, proud Jew, different than the Jew of Bialik hiding in the corner, they will go ahead and take Lag BaOmer and reharness it for their own purposes. And they'll say, this holiday has nothing to do with Akiva or Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but rather we want to remember Bar Kokhba, that general, that Jewish general that fought back against the Romans in that second rebellion that happened after the Great Revolt. That's not entirely accurate information. We have no evidence that that was, in fact, the reason that we light bonfires. However, I think this period of time in which we reharness Jewish memory for our own purpose is something that we will look at as we found the state and we become the new Jew, sovereign in our own land. It will be important to recognize the context in which moments of Jewish history will be reharnessed to serve the purpose of the Jewish people at that time in order to propel them forward. And the fact that someone like myself can come and go ahead and say, you know what, maybe that thing with Bar Kokhba and the bonfires never really happened. Or maybe we don't always praise Elazar ben Yair from Masada because we don't like what the Zealots did. In no means takes away from my own Zionism and my love of this land, but in fact shows a people in transition. And hopefully as we go through all of our sessions together, we recognize and can see that ebb and flow of transition we as a Jewish people go through.
Yeah, Chag Sameach to you, Ori, and to everyone there, to your family.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Sheila.
Sheila.